Good. Okay, so today we're just going to talk a little bit about just the lipid panel, but primarily in terms of the triglycerides, right? So when people talk about the lipid panel, people are like, well, what does it really refer to? And whenever I go through your labs, I make an effort to talk about certain parts of this panel. And some of these terms may start to become familiar for some of you. Things like triglycerides, total cholesterol, LDL, HDL cholesterol, VLDL cholesterol, and homocysteine ESR. All of these have have a lot of significance in terms of creating your cardiovascular risk profile, and optimizing all of these individually is going to be key long term. And I kind of go through my suggestions for what you can do to optimize them, but I don't really share the reasoning behind why I do these things. And this is just an effort to kind of help explain some of that. So let's talk a little bit about triglycerides. What exactly are triglycerides? Well, triglycerides, all they really are a chemical structure of glycerol and fatty acids. And what are fatty acids? Well, they are basically energy sources for the body. Fatty acids are utilized for energy production in many cells, and they are stored, of course, in adipose tissue, and triglycerides are a main way in which we obtain them. And so the way in which you obtain them primarily is you get them obviously from your diet, you absorb them, and they are absorbed in the lymphatic system. And they are absorbed in these molecules called chylomicrons. Maybe you've heard about them. Chylomicrons contain triglycerides, cholesterol, a lot of this information from fatty acids, right? Once they come into the body and they're absorbed in lymphatics, some of them will actually go directly to cells, and a portion will actually go to the liver, in which cholesterol is deposited in the liver. Cholesterol is very important for many different functions. Hormone production is one of them. Cellular structure is another one. And you can actually get additional triglycerides from the liver as well. It should one of these chylomicrons decide not to go to the liver and go straight to adipose tissue, it can, and it can deposit its fatty acids straight into adipose tissue. And you can see how fatty acids are removed from this chylomicron and created into this more stable substance called triacylglycerol. And that's just essentially just a bunch of fatty acids congealed together in a more steady state. I'm just going to actually put all these individuals here. Okay. And so that's basically, I mean, maybe a little bit too scientific, but just a basic overview of what we're talking about when we talk about triglycerides, right? What is the significance of them? Well, so if your triglycerides are elevated, it can lead to some poor outcomes. So maybe some of you guys have heard of something called metabolic syndrome. What exactly is metabolic syndrome? Well, it's something that a coalition of cardiologists, endocrinologists, many other physicians have come to aggregate that radically increases your risk of heart disease, of diabetes, of stroke. And basically it consists of a couple of different things, one of which is a high triglyceride, anything above 150, which is why I try to encourage people to stay under 150 milligrams per deciliter, ideally under 100, right? A low HDL, so less than 40, obesity, so waistline circumference of greater than 40 inches, or for women, greater than 35 inches, high blood pressure, greater than 130/80, and then finally high fasting blood glucose, which is something that I tend to maybe harp on as well. Try to get your fasting blood glucose down, right? Really by changing your diet, right? And so the less of these items you have, the less likely you're to develop metabolic syndrome, and the less likely you're going to develop a heart attack, stroke, and diabetes, because they're strongly correlated with those developing. So what about exactly, let's just talk really specifically in terms of triglycerides. So, as I mentioned, they are used as an energy source because fatty acids can be used for energy for production of ATP in cells, and it's stored in the adipose tissue, as I kind of showed. Another term that you guys may see hanging around is something called VLDL. So I always talk about how your VLDL is a really unhealthy form of your LDL, right? And you want to lower that, right? Well, that's actually where a large amount of the triglycerides are stored, right? So if you have large amounts of VLDL, you have large amounts of triglycerides, which is, as we'll find out, pretty bad. And one thing that is really important that research is showing, sugar and carbs contribute to your triglycerides much higher than fats. So really controlling your carbohydrate intake, particularly simple carbohydrates, is really key. And then again, this is really common to everybody here. So again, I always talk about trying to keep your triglycerides under 100 because that's ideal. Now you can see the range here. Most of my patients, thankfully, are below that at the high range. Some patients are in the borderline high, but ideally we all want to be in between the 50 to 100, which is an ideal range, low a risk for heart disease, stroke, vascular disease long term, and it's definitely doable. Okay, and what do you think might cause high triglycerides? So there's many different factors here, but I kind of bolded the ones that are most pertinent to the patients available here. Obviously, a high-fat diet can contribute to it, but it's really carbohydrate intake. So a diet high in refined sugars, diet high in carbohydrates, obviously unhealthy fats, more like saturated fats and trans fats tend to contribute to high triglycerides. And then some of the issues that correlate with eating poorly, being overweight or obese, chronic inflammation, which can occur, with processed foods. And then of course, some of the things that we actually try to improve, right? Sex hormone imbalances. So optimizing your testosterone can actually optimize your lipid profile. Interesting. It actually has been shown to increase HDL and decrease LDL, provided, of course, you don't overshoot the levels. And that's true for men and women. And then, of course, an underactive thyroid. So making sure your T3 levels are appropriate can also help too. Some of the symptoms, well, so if you have high triglycerides, you don't necessarily get symptoms per se unless they're extremely elevated. So this is maybe drawing back when I was in medical school and I was an intern and taking care of patients on the floor, but we used to take care of patients with pancreatitis all the time. And sometimes we'd see their triglyceride levels go into the thousands. If they go super high, like, the high hundreds, yes, you're going to inflame your pancreas and get nausea, vomiting, severe abdominal pain. Hopefully none of you have ever experienced that, but it's a very uncomfortable situation. What's more common with individuals that have high triglycerides is something called xanthomas. And what these really are just collections under the skin of fatty acids. And they tend to occur with people who have chronically high fatty acids. And you may see these. This is a small child with it around their knee. That's very common, but also really common is around the eye. Maybe you see individuals that have that. And the next one. Okay, and then just a point about the types of fats. Remember, triglycerides are a fatty acid connected to glycerol, right? And so there are 3 fatty acids, but there are different types of fats, right? And so I'm sure you guys have heard about saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and trans fatty acids, right? And so why is it so key that I always talk about reduce your saturated fats, focus on monounsaturated and polyunsaturated? Well, what they really are, and I apologize for the resolution of this graphic here, it just refers to the saturation of the fatty acids and the hydrogen bonds to them, right? And as you can see with the saturated fatty acid, all of the carbon atoms have hydrogens associated to them. Whereas with a monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fatty acid, some of the carbon atoms don't have hydrogen atoms associated with them. That's all it really is. And it's been shown that monounsaturated and polyunsaturated oils are much healthier long-term for vascular health. One consequence, of course, of the fact of being mono or polyunsaturated is that you're going to be a liquid at room temperature. And for large corporations, this was not the best thing. So they were like, well, hey, how can we make vegetable oil, which is a lot cheaper than saturated fat or than animal fat, into a solid form? So they created these things called trans fatty acids, which they hydrogenated vegetable oils, hence things like Crisco or margarine, which unfortunately, which they initially, I'm sure some of you probably had used margarine in the past, was kind of posed as a super healthy alternative because, hey, it's way cheaper and it's great, but actually turned out to be far worse than saturated fats in terms of heart health. So definitely avoid trans fatty acids, which unfortunately in most processed foods, they're abundant. Okay, I just have one other individual that wanted to get admitted here. Okay, and then, and we're almost done with this right here. Finally, what about treatment of high triglycerides? Well, so if if I was a conventional physician, my first goal would be to put you on the fibrates, like benafibrate, or Gemfrezil, maybe Lopid, something you guys have heard about. I am not a big fan of these. What these pretty much do is they are PPAR receptor inhibitors. So basically they work to change some of the machinery within the cell that helps with lipid metabolism. There's lots of side effects associated with them. Pancreatitis is one of them. So I am more of a fan of really focusing on your diet, lowering your carbs, lowering your saturated and trans fats, reducing your gluten, reducing your dairy, and using high fibers. And then really, if you're going to utilize carbohydrates, eating them earlier in the day and make sure that they are more complex in nature. I have found a lot of success. I've seen some pretty amazing success stories. Individuals with triglycerides in the high 300s cut down to the low hundreds and even below 100 just by changing their diet, and that's a big deal. In addition, some of these supplements here are pretty familiar to individuals on the Rhyme pack, or just the individuals utilizing the supplements to recommend as part of that plan. These are all very important in triglyceride metabolism: coenzyme Q10, carnitine, DHA, and EPA, which are polyunsaturated fatty acids, the derivatives of fish oil, and then probiotics. And then, of course, lifestyle changes. So just the fact of exercising and working out and resistance training appears to reduce triglycerides. Okay, well, hopefully that didn't take too long, and hopefully that was kind of useful to individuals. So I'm going to start to unmute people. That's kind of what I wanted to talk about today, really just to kind of elucidate, what triglycerides are, some of the more interesting points in regards to them. And again, it's going to be part of a series on your lipid panel. We'll talk about this in a couple of presentations. JD, did you have anything that you wanted to add, or anything from the operation side?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was it's always interesting to hear about the lipids